This is an early 916 that a customer brought in for me to resurrect. It's been off the road for a long time. And he asked me if I was going to do a video, and I said, well, no, because it's probably not that interesting to catalogue all the stuff you need to do, but then I thought it probably is. So this is one of the Varese built bikes that people think are worth more money than a Bologna built bike. I'm not sure why. They were built at Varese because there was a fire in the Bologna paint shop, as far as I recall. And so they moved production for the first couple of thousand. This one is the highest VIN number V bike I've seen. It's just under 2,000. Start with a couple of sort of typical 916 things. When I say 916, I mean 748, 916, 996, and 998. They're all much the same bike, except for the stuff that's different. But most of they're the same. One thing that you'll see on 916s that is quite unique is the mirror screws. You'll find a mirror screw here. Mirror screw, which is a little brass screw with a reduced shank here. And the reason for that is when your mirrors are on the bike, like so, if the bike goes down, the mirror gets knocked, the little bolt that's in there gets its head broken off, then the mirror falls off. If the mirrors don't fall off, if you have a normal bolt in them, it's just bike head on one side, and it's all really secure, it tends to break this mount piece out of the headlight mount here, and then it breaks the fairing as well. So that's why you pay $12 or $13, whatever it is, for the little brass screws, instead of putting something cheaper in and feeling good about it, because if it goes down, it'll make a big mess. One way to tell if a 916 has been crashed, and it's pretty easy, often these will be broken out here. If the bike just falls over in the garage and it gets a knock on the mirror, it'll push this in, twist it around and crack it out there. If you're doing a crash repair as a shop, then you would always replace these. But what didn't get replaced, generally, were top triple clamps. And what happens, you can see here there's a little pin that locates the handlebar in the top triple clamp. Well, when the bars go down and get a big knock, that pin moves as the bar rotates and it breaks this little section here out of the triple clamp, or bends it. So if you want to know if one's been down, even if it's just fallen over, then that's usually the best place to look, because I think a couple of times we got top triple clamps replaced as part of crash repairs, but it was a real argument with the assessor because they just wouldn't replace things like that, because it was I don't know how much they would have been several $100s, and the assessors just didn't see the point generally, unless you really argued it. This one has only got about 13,000 Ks on it, but it's been sitting for a long time. And so the things that go wrong with these things when they've been sitting for a long time, this one, you can't really move the brakes. You can a bit, and the rear brake's the same. Goes down and it's just stopped. What I did was I just cracked the banjo bolts here and here to see if I could then move the levers, and I could. So that means the master cylinders at least are moving, and it was sucking fluid in, which means the compensating port, which is in here, or down in here where the inlet is, the compensating port's clear. If the compensating ports are blocked, which they usually are when they've been sitting, they won't suck fluid in. And so if you can get it to pump fluid, when you close the bleeder and then release the lever, there'll be a vacuum in the hose and you'll lose your brakes. So that's one good sign that the compensating port in here is blocked. You can pull this elbow out, just lever it out, and then I usually use a 0.6mm drill bit just to hand drill through the compensating port, clear that, give it a good clean up, and then it's usually good to go. The master bores themselves are usually pretty good. It's the compensating ports that is the problem. This has the original rubber brake lines with the olive fittings, and you can't get these hoses anymore. These ones are blocked, and that's why these brakes aren't working. Now you can, if you like, try and push the crap through them, but it just means that the interior of the rubber hose has failed and you just don't want to use it, so get rid of them. If you want to be super original, that's where the problem starts. All the bikes in Australia had rubber hoses because braided hoses were not legal in Australia back then. It wasn't until about 2000, I think, that braided hoses were finally approved in Australia. So everything we had rubber. Some of the European models, I think, had braided hoses at this point. You can get aftermarket hoses made, which is what I'll do for this bike. We'll just get a braided hose with a black coating, and I'll probably just have silver fittings on it, because you simply can't get these olive ones as far as I've looked, which is unfortunate because you can't replicate it completely, but that's all you can do. On the rear brake with this hose, goes all the way around here. It's just blocked up and had it too. More things that fail on these 916s are the air runners, although this one is a really early one, and you can see these actually have rubber inserts, like little well nuts in them. And what happened when you tighten these up, they would separate and the cover would lift off these. And fairly soon afterwards, they changed these to take self-tapping screws, which means you just tighten them up. But what happened then, and what I've been seeing a lot of over the last few years, is these covers would all crack where the screws go through. And it got to the point where undamaged covers were getting pretty hard to find. In the past few years, Ducati have restarted production of lots of 916 series parts, and you can buy these covers and these inners brand new. They're about $130 for a pair of inners and a pair of outers. I tend to sell lots of outers because they crack, but on this bike we'll put inners on it as well. There were some fiberglass outers available like 15 years ago. I remember doing a smash repair at Moto 1 just before the end of Moto 1 in 2008, where they supplied us some gel coat fiberglass things, and I have seen them where the holes don't match up with the inners. So you try and put the screws in and the holes are just clearly in the wrong spot. So these days you can get these again, and that's a really good way to fix those problems. This is the debris that's come out of this bike so far. Old belts. This is what air filters do over time. They just perish and the foam just falls apart. Poke your finger through it. But they're easy to get. This is the fuel filter and fuel pump. And this is typical damage to a hose after being sitting in fuel forever, and you just replace all that stuff. This is the filter from the bottom of the pump, which sits down in this hole here in the pump plate. You can get all this stuff, so you just buy new stuff and replace it all. This one had leaks in the fuel tank. I'm not really sure where. This O-ring to me didn't look like it was leaking at all, but I'll show you the bottom of the fuel tank. But this is the external fuel hoses, and this is what's happened to them, where the fuel's got onto them. As a consequence of that, one of the real issues with this bike possibly is all this, which is rubber that has been dissolved by petrol, and it's even down, and in the webbing behind the cylinder is this black goo, and I really don't know how the owner's going to get that off. The actual fuel tank on the bike, which is here, has got a lot of paint damage externally, but I'm concerned there's a hole in the tank here. Usually you don't get this sort of external damage. I see quite a lot of tanks rust out. Lots of them rust out across here. There'll be little holes. They rust out around this drain bung. This is the lowest point when the bike's on the side stand. It's tilted over. It doesn't really look like it's got a hole in it, but I haven't got into it, and I'm going to let the painters take care of getting inside and seeing if it has got holes in it. There was quite a lot of rust from under here, like a big chunk that looked like it was that sort of shape that had fallen off into the tank. So that sort of thing I personally leave to the painters, because they're the ones who have the best idea on how to fix it properly. It's not my department as such, but you really need to be aware of rust. These things are rusting their fuel tanks. The tank itself is not too bad inside, and it doesn't have the black lining. If you look in the tank here, you can just see that it's just metal. 916 series bikes usually have a black liner, but it's not a complete liner that seals, it's just funny sort of stuff. You can peel it off, often in big sheets. It is very good at generating rust behind them. Some of the ones I've had, you put a rust treatment in the tank and then it all falls off and the whole tank will be just rusty behind it. So I'm not really sure what it actually was or what its purpose was, but in the grand scheme of things, it wasn't anything useful in stopping them rusting at all. This is the airbox, and typically of 94 to 98 airboxes, it's cracked. You see it's cracked here. It's cracked down here, it's cracked over this side here, or roll around all the bolt holes, possibly around the back ones as well. And that's typical of a 94 to 98 airbox. These days, if you want to find a 99 or later, they're much better. And the 99s and later will have ribs underneath, whereas this one is just smooth. And also the 99s and later have a different seal. The early bikes had this C shape, and the later bikes have a full circle rubber seal that seals much better to the bottom of the fuel tank. These days I tend to fit carbon fibre ones, and this bike's going to get a carbon fibre one that's going to be painted to replicate the original, because he just wants it to be as original as possible. Other things to look for, I've put new fuel hoses on the throttle bodies, and you can see the injectors are out. They're out getting cleaned. These days, even if they do click, I tend to pull them out and just get them cleaned, because if it's been sitting for that long, it's just one less thing that you'll need to pull the bike apart for after you've assembled it to fix. So you do everything while it's in bits, and it tends to get everything done. One thing to be really wary of is these aluminium fitting oil cooler hoses. I just don't undo them these days unless I absolutely have to, and usually if you undo it and then try and refit it, even the slightest bit of tension on that nut will split the hose on the flare inside and it will leak. I've never refitted one of these hoses in the last few years and had it actually work. They always just split. So unless I need to remove them, I just don't. Chain sliders are one thing that fails these days regularly. I actually keep these in stock because I see so many of them broken. They just crack and fall apart. The one underneath, as you can see, is almost completely missing. They're not very expensive and they're pretty easy to get, so I always replace them. This one's had the side stand bolt cut. As you can see up here, there's no extension on it. It had a nut on the end originally, so the stand would flick up, and you can see the head of the bolts coming out, which is what they do. So we used to cut lots of them off, and they all used to wind themselves out slowly. Even if you Loctited them, they'd still wind themselves out. Being an early bike, this has a P8 ECU and a aluminium monoposto subframe. One thing that I find on these bikes that tends to last forever is the radiator hoses. I've only ever replaced one or two on these bikes. They just don't ever seem to fail. It's quite amazing. This is an original clutch slave cylinder, and for the sake of originality, I'm going to pull it off, pop the piston out, lineage the bore of it, put a new seal on it, put it back together again. They usually work quite well. If you keep the fluid clean, I usually replace the fluid or try to do it every year if I'm doing annual servicing, just to try and keep the fluid and the slaves clean. But these ones really are quite okay. If you don't want to be bothered with having to replace the seals every few years, then you can put an aftermarket one on it. Again, that solves the problem. Depends how you want to deal with it.